you've written a script, you're really happy with it, and you share it with others or submit it to a contest so you can get feedback on it. And the feedback comes, but you're not sure how to actually interpret the notes because, and this happens more than you think, people don't always say what they mean, or they don't always know how to say what they mean. And it seems like their notes contradict other notes that you've gotten, and you're just not sure what to do. And what you need is a secret decoder ring for interpreting notes. To talk about interpreting notes, we've got to get a couple of things out of the way. One, the reason notes are hard to interpret is not because the note givers don't know what they're talking about. They may not always be able to clearly articulate the problem, but if you are getting a note, there is an issue with the script. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. Every note is a good note. That's the first thing that you have to understand. Number two, not every note is one you have to fix. But wait, Jake, didn't you just kind of say the opposite? Well, yeah, I did. So let me explain. If someone tells you, I didn't like blank, okay, that's a great note. You want to know that. You want to know what the audience thinks of your story. And if they don't like it, that's important for you to know. So in that sense, every note is a good note. At the same time, maybe you wanted them to react in that way at that particular moment about that particular thing. And in this case, while the note is good, it's also an irrelevant note because the script is doing exactly what you wanted it to do. However, if they say, I don't like this part, which is a good note, but if you wanted them to like that part, well, now you have some work to do. So stop dismissing contradictory notes. They may not be a bad thing. But if you don't know what your intention was with the story at that moment, that might be why you're getting contradictory notes. In other words, it's not that the notes are not clear. It's that you, the storyteller, are not being clear. And that's something you're going to have to address in a future draft. And the third piece of groundwork we have to address, it's hard to interpret notes if you don't know the difference between story and storytelling. The story is the someone who wants something badly, they're having trouble getting it, and they get it or they don't part. The storytelling is the how you convey that story to the reader part. And some notes you get will indicate that you have a story problem. Some notes are going to indicate that you have a storytelling problem. But here's the important part. Most readers of scripts don't know the difference between story and storytelling like you should know. And they give you a note that sounds like the problem is a story problem, when it is in fact a storytelling problem. And if you don't know the difference between the two, you will not know how to fix the problem. And the worst case is you actually try and fix the wrong thing, and it makes the whole screenplay even worse. You think the problem is a story problem, and you modify the story, but the problem was actually a storytelling problem. And now you've made your story worse, and you still haven't addressed the real problem, which is a problem. So let's avoid making your screenplay worse. Your first order of business then is to learn the difference between story and storytelling. Because if you know the difference between story and storytelling, you can more quickly craft stories that work and tell them in effective ways and know how to properly interpret any notes that you get. So the reason you're getting confused about the notes you get back is not because you can't write. It's because you haven't yet learned to discern between story and storytelling. And when the note givers don't know the difference, the notes just kind of seem vague and jumbled. So here's a quick tip. If you get notes about the story that are vague or that are based on how the reader is just reacting to the story, you have to understand that that reader doesn't know the difference between story and storytelling. And you are now going to have to do the hard work and pull out your story and storytelling decoder ring to decipher their notes. Because you might get a note that says, yeah, the story just isn't working for me. And you think it's a story note, but it's not. So I'm going to give you a short 5-question quiz. And each question can be worth 10 points if you want, if you want to keep track and brag about it in the comments. And I'll give you a few seconds to consider your answer after each question. And then we'll quickly pull everything apart after each question before moving to the next one. The questions themselves are going to be more like the statements that you're going to get. They're more like the notes that you might get. And you must choose if the root problem is a story problem or a storytelling problem based on the note. And if you get them all right, then you're on your way to learning the difference between story and storytelling. The first one, here's the note. The protagonist's decision to blow up the spaceship at the end didn't make sense. Is this a story problem or a storytelling problem? The protagonist's decision to blow up the spaceship at the end didn't make sense. Story problem or storytelling problem? This note is a result of story logic, and the reader thinks the character is just going to do XYZ, but instead the character does WGP, and so they make a note about their misunderstanding or their logic problem. And anytime something doesn't make sense, that's usually a story issue. The logic of the world you've created is broken on some level, so you have to modify the logic so the decisions a character makes seem logical. And if there's no logic, it's a broken story. This one's a story problem. Hopefully you got this one right, but they do get a little harder. Okay, number 2, the note. I just couldn't follow what was happening. Is this a story problem or a storytelling problem? I just couldn't follow what was happening. Story problem, storytelling problem. Now this one's a bit tricky, and playing off the first question, if something doesn't make sense, well, that kind of gets into logic, and logic issues are more often than not story issues. However, when the audience is involved, that's when it becomes a storytelling issue. So anytime the audience feels what you don't want them to feel, it's a storytelling issue. And if the reader can't follow what's happening, that is probably a storytelling issue. The way you're telling the story is not making sense to the reader. And if they're lost, you're not doing your job. You have to think of the storytelling part of screenwriting as the tour guide part. You are leading the reader through the story. And if you skip over things or get things out of order or skip through things, okay, the reader gets lost and the reader can't follow, and that's never a good thing. So if the reader is involved, it's a storytelling problem. So this one is a storytelling problem, even though the note sounds like a story problem. Number 3, the note. I didn't know what to be rooting for, or I didn't know who to be rooting for. Is this a story problem or a storytelling problem? It might be the same answer for both questions, it might not be, so answer both independently, okay? This is a twofer. I didn't know what to be rooting for, or I didn't know who to be rooting for. Is this a story problem or a storytelling problem? If the reader doesn't know what to be rooting for, that's a story problem. They don't understand the stakes, and the stakes are always story related. If there are no stakes, or the stakes aren't believable, story logic, or if the stakes don't make sense, story problem. But if the reader doesn't know who to be rooting for, that could be either a story or storytelling problem, and you're gonna have to do some digging on this one. So if you're getting coverage on your script, the reader will include this missing information somewhere in their notes. And if you have friends reading the script, you can follow up. And this is the information you're looking for. Can the reader properly identify the main character? Remember, a story is about someone who wants something badly. So can the reader accurately identify the who? If they can't identify who the main character is, but you get the note, I didn't know who to be rooting for, okay, that's a storytelling problem. Because they know the story, they know the story part, they just don't know the storytelling part. In other words, they know who the main character is, but you are not doing a good enough job making them care about the main character to either root for them or against them, and they need to be doing one or the other. But if they cannot identify who the main character is, then that is a story problem, because you haven't clearly identified who the someone of your story actually is. And if people can't pick out the main character, okay, yeah, that's a big story problem and they're out. Note number 4, I got confused. Is this a story problem or a storytelling problem? Now this could be a standalone statement, it could be paired with anything. I got confused when, I got confused about. It doesn't matter what comes after. The answer is always the same. I got confused. Is it story or storytelling note? Confusion is all about how the audience feels. If the problem were logic, the reader would say, I didn't understand. But when the reader starts assigning emotions like confusion or frustration or aggravation, this is a storytelling issue. And what you have to do is decide first, do I want the audience to feel that way at this moment? And if you do, that's great. Don't change anything. Maybe you want them to be confused at that moment. that's still a good note because you know your storytelling is working like you want it to work. But if you don't want the audience to feel that way, then you have some storytelling work to do. And maybe the audience is saying, I just don't want to feel that way at this moment, which impacts their enjoyment of the script. It impacts the entertainment value of the story that you're trying to tell, and you want them to be entertained. So even if you thought you wanted the audience to be confused at that moment, maybe you need to reconsider and either let them not be confused or at least not let them be confused for as long. But confusion is a storytelling note. Number 5, the last one, the note. I didn't care about the protagonist at all. Is this a story problem or a storytelling problem? I didn't care about the protagonist at all. Story problem, storytelling problem. Caring is an emotion, and because it's an emotion, it makes this note a storytelling problem. But this one gets writers into a lot of trouble, because many times when writers get this note, they just start trying to add a bunch of stuff to the protagonist and making their backstory all one of sadness and regret, with the hopes that now the audience is going to care about the protagonist. But you might have been just fine if you spent the time crafting your protagonist before you started writing. And if you did, then you know that your protagonist is in good shape. But still, when you get this note, you start adding stuff that you don't need in your story in the hopes of making your character more likable or whatever. But that's not the issue. The issue is the reader didn't care about your protagonist. And because caring is an emotion, this puts this note squarely in the storytelling realm. And that means you did not do a good enough job in the crafting of your story to give the audience better opportunities to care about what happens to your protagonist. I've seen screenwriters take out and add a bunch of pages to their screenplay when all they probably needed to do was tweak a few action lines and maybe the character introduction. First impressions go a long way. So maybe you need a better first impression of your character. And if you want to know how to write better character introductions, watch this. If you found value, don't forget about all the fun buttons below, comment about what was helpful, and whenever you tell a story, be sure to tell a story that matters. See you later.